The doctor's office was cold, sterile, and smelled of rubbing alcohol and quiet despair. I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, my feet dangling a few inches from the floor like a child's. I felt like a child, a confused and a frightened and a deeply, deeply powerless child. My son, my Michael, was sitting in the chair beside me, his hand on my arm, his face a mask of perfect, loving, and deeply, deeply fraudulent concern. He was talking to the doctor, a young and a tired and a deeply, deeply overworked man named Dr. Evans. "It's her memory, doctor," Michael was saying, his voice a low and a sad and a deeply, deeply convincing murmur. "She's been getting so forgetful. She misplaces things. She gets confused. Last week she accused me of stealing her life savings. All of it. She thinks I've taken everything." He shook his head, a gesture of profound and of weary and of deeply, deeply theatrical sorrow. "I know it's not her fault. I know it's the dementia. But it's getting worse. She's becoming a danger to herself and to us. We're at our wits' end. We don't know what to do." Dr. Evans looked at me, his eyes full of a kind and a professional and a deeply, deeply condescending pity. He saw a frail and a confused and a deeply, deeply pathetic old woman. He saw exactly what my son wanted him to see. "Eleanor," he said, his voice the gentle and the slow and the deeply, deeply insulting tone one uses for a person who is not all there. "Do you know where you are today?" I looked at him. I looked at my son, at his beautiful and his lying and his deeply, deeply monstrous face. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to tell them the truth that my memory was a steel trap, the truth that I was not confused, the truth that he, a haughty, stolen my life savings, every last, and a hard-earned, and a deeply, deeply precious penny of it. But the words would not come, because for the past 6 months I had been a prisoner in my own home, a victim of a quiet and a systematic and a deeply, deeply evil campaign of psychological warfare, a campaign designed to make me, and everyone around me, believe that I was losing my mind. And I, in my fear, in my confusion, in my deep and my abiding, and my deeply, deeply foolish love for my son, I had almost started to believe it myself. So I just sat there, and I looked at him, and a single and a hot and a deeply, deeply satisfying tear of pure and of unadulterated and of deeply, deeply righteous rage rolled down my cheek. And my son, my beautiful and my monstrous and my deeply, deeply stupid son, he saw that tear and he smiled, a small and a sad and a deeply, deeply triumphant smile. He thought it was a tear of confusion, of senility, of defeat. He had no idea that it was a tear of war. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully and brilliantly and finally convinced the world that his mother was crazy. He had no idea that his crazy mother had, just the day before, had a very long and a very productive and a deeply, deeply satisfying meeting with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit of the City Police Department. He had no idea that while he was busy stealing my life savings, I had been busy stealing his freedom. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Eleanor. I'm 78 years old. My son stole every penny I had in the world, and then he tried to have me committed to a psychiatric hospital by convincing the world I was insane. The secret I'm sharing with you today is not that my son is a thief. The secret is that for the past 6 months, while he thought he was driving me mad, I was in fact driving him into a trap. A beautiful and an intricate and a deeply, deeply satisfying legal trap that was about to snap shut on his greedy and his arrogant and his deeply, deeply deserving little hands. You see, I am not a wealthy woman. Or rather, I was not. My late husband and I were simple people. We were teachers. We had a small and a comfortable and a deeply, deeply loved home. We had our pensions. And we had our life savings, a modest but a precious nest egg that we had spent a lifetime building. A nest egg that was meant to be our security in our old age. A nest egg that my son, and his beautiful, and his ambitious, and his deeply, deeply greedy wife had over the past year systematically and ruthlessly and completely drained. They did it with 1,000 tiny cuts, 1,000 small lies, 1,000 moments of quiet and of loving and of deeply, deeply fraudulent gaslighting. They did it by convincing me that I was losing my mind, that I was forgetful, that I was confused, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. And I, in my grief, in my loneliness, in my deep and my abiding, and my deeply, deeply foolish love for my only child, I had let them. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. They saw a quiet and a gentle and a deeply, deeply trusting old woman. They did not see the woman who had spent 40 years as a high school history teacher, a woman who had a deep and an abiding and a deeply, deeply practical understanding of the nature of tyrants, of con artists, of the slow and the insidious, and the deeply, deeply evil art of the long con. They thought they were rewriting my history. They had no idea that I was busy documenting theirs. So please, get comfortable. This is a story about a son who tried to steal his mother's sanity, and a mother who decided, in return, to steal his freedom. It is a story of a quiet, and a desperate, and a deeply, deeply satisfying battle of wits, fought in the silent, and the lonely, and the deeply, deeply terrifying landscape of my own home. Your support, your likes and subscriptions to Voices of the Forgotten are a quiet, and a powerful, and a deeply, deeply appreciated testament to the fact that you can steal a woman's money, you can steal her home, but you can never, ever steal her mind. To understand how a son could look his own mother in the eye and call her crazy after he had stolen her life savings, you have to understand the life of quiet and of honest and of deeply, deeply ordinary decency that he was so desperate to escape. You have to understand the man I raised and the woman who taught him to despise the very world that had created him. My life with my husband, my Frank, was a small and a quiet and a deeply, deeply happy one. We were teachers. Frank taught high school history, and I taught English. We were not people who were destined for greatness, for wealth, for power. We were people who found our joy in the small, and the quiet, and the deeply, deeply meaningful things of the world. A well-taught lesson, a perfectly ripe tomato from our small, and our meticulously tended backyard garden. A long and a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying walk in the woods on a crisp autumn afternoon. Our home was a reflection of our life. It was a small and a sturdy and a deeply, deeply loved brick bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a house filled not with expensive things, but with a lifetime of books, of music, of the quiet and the comfortable, and the deeply, deeply satisfying clutter of a life well lived. We were not rich in money, but we were billionaires in contentment. We raised our son, Michael, in this world of quiet, and of gentle, and of deeply, deeply intellectual, and of deeply, deeply un-American contentment. He was a good boy, a quiet boy, a boy who, like us, loved books and ideas and long and quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying conversations about the meaning of life. He was a boy who was destined, we thought, to become a man just like his father, a teacher, a scholar, a quiet and a gentle and a deeply, deeply decent man. And then, in his senior year of college, he met Jessica. Jessica was not a woman of quiet contentment. She was a woman of a loud and a restless and a deeply, deeply consuming ambition. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy, of confidence, of a raw and a naked and a deeply, deeply unapologetic hunger for the things of the world. She was studying business, and she spoke a language we did not understand, a language of branding, of marketing, of leverage, of a ruthless and a relentless and a deeply, deeply soulless pursuit of a thing she called success. She was beautiful. She was brilliant. And she was, I see now, a predator who had been stalking my son, my quiet and my gentle and my deeply, deeply vulnerable son. For months, she saw in him not a partner, not a lover, but an asset, a project, a piece of raw and of gentle and of deeply, deeply malleable material that she could shape and mold and transform into the kind of man she needed, the kind of man who could give her the kind of life she so desperately and so shamelessly craved. I did not like her. I did not trust her. I saw the hardness in her eyes, the cold and the calculating and the deeply, deeply unsettling ambition. But my son, my Michael, he adored her. He was bewitched by her. He saw her ambition not as a flaw, but as a strength. He saw her ruthlessness not as a cruelty, but as a form of exciting and of modern and of deeply, deeply seductive power. He was a quiet and a gentle and a deeply, deeply bookish man who had fallen in love with a beautiful and a brilliant and a deeply, deeply dangerous shark. They were married a year after they graduated, and so began the slow and the quiet and the deeply, deeply insidious process of my son's transformation. Jessica was a master of the art of the slow and the gentle and the deeply, deeply manipulative kind of psychological warfare. She did not try to change him overnight. She did it piece by piece, a quiet and a relentless and a deeply, deeply successful campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. She began by mocking his dreams of becoming a teacher. A teacher, Michael, she would say with a tinkling and a cruel and a deeply, deeply effective laugh. Darling, you're so much smarter than that. You have so much more potential. You could be a CEO, a titan of industry. You could be anything you want to be. Why would you want to be a teacher? She began to mock his friends, the quiet and the intellectual and the deeply, deeply decent young men and women he had grown up with. She called them boring and provincial and lacking in ambition. And slowly, one by one, he began to drift away from them. She began to mock his home, his childhood, his parents. She would come to our house for our traditional Sunday dinners, and she would sit at our table, a beautiful and a polished and a deeply, deeply alien creature in our quiet and our comfortable and our deeply, deeply unfashionable world. She would look at our worn and our comfortable and our deeply, deeply loved furniture with a look of polite and of amused and of deeply, deeply insulting condescension. She would listen to our quiet and our intellectual and our deeply, deeply satisfying conversations with a look of bored and of restless and of deeply, deeply patronizing impatience. And my son, my Michael, he saw it all, and he did nothing. He was a man caught between two worlds, the quiet and the gentle and the deeply, deeply authentic world of his past, and the loud and the shiny and the deeply, deeply fraudulent world of his future. And he chose the future. He chose her. After my Frank passed away 2 years ago, the campaign escalated. My grief, my loneliness, my vulnerability, it was not a source of sympathy for her. It was an opportunity. She and Michael insisted that I sell my house, my beautiful and my quiet and my deeply, deeply beloved home, and move in with them. "It's too much for you to manage, Mom," Michael had said, his voice a perfect echo of his wife's loving and her concerned and her deeply, deeply manipulative logic. "You shouldn't be alone. We can take care of you." And I, in my grief, in my loneliness, in my deep and my abiding, and my deeply, deeply foolish desire to be close to my only child, my only family, I had agreed. I sold my home. I sold my life. I sold my memories. And I gave them the money, a substantial and a life-altering and a deeply, deeply foolish sum to buy a new house. A house that was big enough for all of us. A house that was a monument to their success and to my own, quiet, and my deeply, deeply painful erasure. And that was when the real war began. The war for my sanity. The war for my freedom. The war for my life. The first few months in their new house, the house my life savings had bought, were a masterclass in the art of the slow, and the quiet, and the deeply, deeply insidious kind of psychological torture. I was not a mother in her son's home. I was a prisoner of war. And my daughter-in-law, Jessica, was my warden. My room, the beautiful, and the spacious, and the sun-drenched master suite on the ground floor, was my cell. It was a beautiful cage, a gilded cage, but it was a cage nonetheless. And Jessica, in her infinite, and her loving, and her deeply, deeply manipulative wisdom, had made sure that I knew it. The gaslighting began immediately. It was a quiet, and a relentless, and a deeply, deeply effective campaign to make me doubt my own mind, my own memory, my own sanity. It was a war of 1,000 tiny, and deeply, deeply confusing little battles. It started with my things. Small things at first. My reading glasses, which I always kept on my bedside table, would disappear, only to reappear a day later in the refrigerator. My favorite teacup, the one my husband had given me, would vanish from the kitchen cupboard and turn up in the laundry room. My handbag, which I always left on the chair by the door, would be in the attic. Each time, Jessica would be there, her face a mask of loving, and of patient, and of deeply, deeply fraudulent concern. "Oh, Eleanor," she would say, her voice a soft and a gentle and a deeply, deeply condescending purr. "You've misplaced your things again. Don't you worry. I'll help you find them." And she would, of course, find them, in the most bizarre, and the most unlikely, and the most deeply, deeply unsettling of places. And my son, my Michael, my quiet, and my gentle, and my deeply, deeply, and now I see, tragically, unobservant son, he would look at me with his sad, and his pitying, and his deeply, deeply, deeply worried eyes. "Mom," he would say, his voice full of a genuine, and a loving, and a deeply, deeply misplaced concern. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? You've been so forgetful lately." I was not forgetful. I was being managed. I was being manipulated. I was being driven, slowly and methodically, and deeply, deeply, cruelly mad. The second stage of her campaign was to take over my life. She began to manage my schedule, my appointments, my very existence. My weekly bridge game with my friends was deemed too stressful for me. My monthly book club was too intellectually taxing. My daily walks in the garden were too dangerous. She began to intercept my phone calls, my letters, my connections to the outside world. My friends, my few remaining friends, were told that I was not feeling well enough for visitors. My own son, who lived in the same house, was told that I was resting and that he shouldn't disturb me. My world, which had once been so full of books and of art and of quiet and of deeply, deeply satisfying conversation, began to shrink. It shrank until it was the size of my bedroom. And then it shrank until it was the size of my own, and my increasingly and my deeply, deeply terrified I was a prisoner in my own home, a ghost in my own life, and my daughter-in-law, my beautiful and my charming and my deeply, deeply monstrous daughter-in-law, she was my keeper. The final and the most brutal and the most deeply, deeply terrifying stage of her campaign was the one that was designed to break me completely. It was the one that was designed to make me believe her narrative, to make me believe that I was, in fact, losing my mind. She began to talk to me about things that had never happened. She would ask me about conversations we had never had. She would remind me of promises I had never made. She would tell me stories about my own past, my own life, that were full of small, and of subtle, and of deeply, deeply disorienting inaccuracies. "Don't you remember, Eleanor," she would say, her voice a soft and a gentle and a deeply, deeply poisonous whisper. "You told me yesterday that you wanted me to sell the silver. You said it was too much of a burden for you to polish." I said no such thing, I would say, my own voice a weak and a trembling and a deeply, deeply unconvincing thing. "Oh, but you did, darling," she would say, her eyes full of a deep and a profound and a deeply, deeply fraudulent pity. You don't remember. Your memory, it's not what it used to be." She was a master of the art. She was a virtuoso of gaslighting. She was a quiet and a patient and a deeply, deeply evil artist, and my own, and my fragile, and my deeply, deeply terrified mind was her canvas. And I, in my loneliness, in my grief, in my profound, and my deeply, deeply foolish love for my son, I began to doubt myself. I began to wonder if she was right, if I was, in fact, losing my mind, if the world was, in fact, the strange and the confusing and the deeply, deeply terrifying place she was telling me it was. The turning point, the moment the fog of her deception began to clear, and the cold and the hard and the deeply, deeply satisfying light of the truth began to shine through, came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the day of my annual cardiology appointment, an appointment that Jessica, of course, had insisted on scheduling and on driving me to. We were in the doctor's office, the same cold and the same sterile and the same deeply, deeply depressing office where I had been just a few weeks earlier. And Jessica was giving the performance of her life. She was telling the doctor, a new and a young and a deeply, deeply impressionable man, the story of my sad and my tragic and my deeply, deeply fraudulent decline. She told him about my memory lapses, my confusion, my delusions. She told him about my paranoid belief that she was moving my things. And she told him, her voice a masterpiece of loving and of concerned and of deeply, deeply manipulative sorrow, that she was worried I was becoming a danger to myself. And then she delivered the line that was to be her fatal mistake. "And last week, doctor," she said, her eyes filling with beautiful and with fake and with deeply, deeply satisfying tears, "she accused my husband, her own son, of stealing her life savings, her entire life savings. She became hysterical. She said he had taken everything. It was a complete and a total and a deeply, deeply terrifying delusion." The doctor looked at me, his face a mask of professional and of pitying and of deeply, deeply condescending concern. He saw a frail and a confused and a deeply, deeply pathetic old woman. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see, but I was no longer looking at him. I was looking at her. And in that moment, in that cold and that sterile and that deeply, deeply satisfying moment, the fog in my mind cleared. And I saw her. I saw her for what she truly was. Not a loving and a concerned and a deeply, deeply devoted daughter-in-law, but a thief, a liar, and a monster. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard and as sharp as a shard of ice, that she was not just trying to drive me mad. She was trying to build a case to have me declared legally incompetent, a case that would give her and my son complete and total and utterly, utterly unquestioned control over my life, my home, and my money. And I knew, in that same and that cold and that clear and that deeply, deeply satisfying moment, that I was not going to let her win. The game was not over. It had just begun. And I, the quiet and the frail and the deeply, deeply underestimated old history teacher, was about to teach my brilliant and my ambitious and my deeply, deeply evil daughter-in-law a final and a brutal and a deeply, deeply satisfying lesson in the art of war. The week between that doctor's appointment and the day of my reckoning was the longest and most terrifyingly lucid week of my life. The fog of my self-doubt, the fog that Jessica had so masterfully and so cruelly cultivated, had been burned away by the white-hot fire of the truth. I was not crazy. I was a victim. and I was about to become a warrior. I spent that week in a state of quiet, and of focused, and of deeply, deeply satisfying preparation. I was no longer a passive observer in my own home. I was an active, and a silent, and a deeply, deeply dangerous spy. I began to document everything. I used the small hidden nanny cam that my son had so helpfully installed in my room to keep an eye on me, he had said, to record my own lucidity. I would sit in my armchair, and I would speak to the camera. I would read aloud from the day's newspaper, my voice clear and steady. I would work on a complex crossword puzzle, my mind sharp and focused. I would tell stories, my stories, the stories of my life, my memories clear and precise and utterly, utterly undeniable. I was creating a video diary, a testament to my own sanity, a weapon against their lies. I also began to gather my evidence, the real evidence, the evidence that would transform their campaign of quiet, domestic gaslighting into a case of loud and public and deeply, deeply satisfying criminal fraud. I knew where my son kept his financial records. In his home office, the room that had once been my husband's study. He was a man of meticulous and of deeply, deeply predictable habits. He kept everything in a locked, 4-drawer filing cabinet. A filing cabinet to which I, in a moment of foresight I did not even know I possessed, had made a copy of the key years ago. I waited for a day when they were both out of the house, a day when I was supposed to be having my afternoon nap. And I went to work. I was a quiet and a slow and a deeply, deeply arthritic cat burglar. I let myself into his office, my heart pounding, and I opened the filing cabinet. And there it was. The entire, sordid, and deeply, deeply satisfying story of their financial lives. It was a story of debt, of desperation, of a lifestyle built on a foundation of lies and my own, quiet and steadily dwindling, life savings. I found the statements for the secret credit cards they had opened in my name. I found the bank records detailing the slow and the systematic and the deeply, deeply infuriating siphoning of my pension and my Social Security checks into their own accounts. I found the forged signatures on a dozen different loan applications. And then I found the crown jewel, the final and the most damning and the most deeply, deeply satisfying piece of evidence. It was a life insurance policy, a new and a very large and a deeply, deeply suspicious life insurance policy. A policy they had taken out on me 3 months ago, without my knowledge, without my consent. A policy that named them as the sole beneficiaries. A policy that would only pay out in the event of my accidental death. I stood there, in the quiet of my husband's study, the policy in my hand, and I felt a chill so profound it was a physical pain. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were not just trying to steal my sanity. They were waiting for me to die. And they were growing impatient. I took a picture of every single document. I created a digital archive of their crimes, a beautiful and an intricate and a deeply, deeply damning web of their own making. And then I called my lawyer. Not their lawyer, the slick and the cold-eyed and the deeply, deeply complicit man who had helped them draft my new will, but my lawyer, my old lawyer, a man named Arthur Gable, a man who had been my husband's best friend, a man who had known me for 50 years, a man who I knew with an absolute and an unwavering and a deeply, deeply satisfying certainty would believe me. The meeting in his office was a quiet and a somber and a deeply, deeply satisfying affair. I laid out the evidence on his large mahogany desk. The photographs, the bank statements, the forged signatures, the life insurance policy. He looked at it all, his face a mask of quiet and of growing and of deeply, deeply righteous fury. He did not speak for a long, long time. He just looked at the story of my betrayal, laid out in black and white. "The vultures," he whispered finally, his voice a low and a dangerous and a deeply, deeply satisfying growl. "The goddamn vultures." The plan we devised was not a plan of quiet negotiation. It was not a plan of gentle persuasion. It was a plan of war. A quiet, and a legal, and a deeply, deeply satisfying war. Mr. Gable's first move was to contact the district attorney's office. He presented them with the evidence of the fraud, of the theft, of the conspiracy. He did not mention the life insurance policy. That, he said with a thin and a cold and a deeply, deeply satisfying smile, was our ace in the hole. His second move was to arrange a meeting. A family meeting. A meeting with me, with my son, with my daughter-in-law, and with their lawyer. The stated purpose of the meeting was to discuss my long-term care options. The real purpose of the meeting was to watch them walk, with their own arrogant, and their own greedy, and their own deeply, deeply stupid feet, directly into our trap. The day of the meeting was the day of my resurrection. I was no longer the frail, and the confused, and the deeply, deeply pathetic old woman they had created. I was a queen, on her way to reclaim her kingdom. I wore my best dress, a simple and an elegant and a deeply, deeply satisfying navy blue silk. I wore my mother's pearls. And I walked into that lawyer's office, my head held high, my heart a calm, and a steady and a deeply, deeply satisfied drum. They were already there, sitting at the long polished conference table. My son, his face a mask of weary and of dutiful and of deeply, deeply fraudulent concern. My daughter-in-law, her face a mask of triumphant and of loving and of deeply, deeply evil victory. The meeting began. Their lawyer, the slick and the cold-eyed and the deeply, deeply complicit man, began to speak. He spoke of my diminished capacity. He spoke of my increasing confusion. He spoke of their deep and their abiding and their deeply, deeply fraudulent love for me. And he spoke of the need to make a decision about my future. He slid a document across the table. It was an application for a conservatorship. A legal document that would, if signed, give my son and his wife complete and total and utterly, utterly, utterly unquestioned control over my life, my home, my money, my very existence. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter-in-law. And then I looked at my lawyer, Mr. Gable, and I smiled. A small and a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying smile. "That's a very interesting document," Mr. Gable said, his voice a low and a calm and a deeply, deeply dangerous purr. "But I believe we have a few other documents to discuss first." And he opened his briefcase, and he began to lay out the evidence of their crimes on the polished mahogany table. The bank statements, the credit card bills, the forged signatures. One by one, he laid them out, a beautiful and an intricate and a deeply, deeply satisfying mosaic of their greed. I watched their faces as the truth, the cold and the hard, and the utterly, utterly undeniable truth was revealed. I watched as their masks of loving concern, of triumphant victory, crumbled to dust, revealing the ugly and the terrified and the deeply, deeply pathetic faces of two common and deeply, deeply stupid thieves who had just been caught. But the best part, the most beautiful and the most satisfying and the most deeply, deeply just part of it all was the moment Mr. Gable slid the final document across the table. The life insurance policy. The one that named them as the sole beneficiaries of my accidental death. "And this," he said, his voice a quiet and a final and a deeply, deeply devastating whisper, "is a document that I believe the homicide detectives at the city police department will find particularly interesting." The silence in the room was a thing of beauty. It was the silence of two souls being sucked into a black hole of their own making. It was the silence of a game that had just been, with a quiet and a brutal and a deeply, deeply satisfying finality, won. And I, the quiet and the frail and the deeply, deeply underestimated old woman, I was the winner.